Hi, Nick. Thanks for joining us. I know we'll have a few folks continuing to come in, but I want to introduce our illustrious speaker today. Many of you have known and worked closely with Dr. Jules Bruck, who is the director of the School of Landscape Architecture and Planning, and serves as the chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture. Jules, it seems like she's been here forever, but she just joined the college July 1st, 2022, and hit the ground running, and I don't think ever stopped running. Her vision, coupled with the ability to move ideas into action, is really mobilizing the strengths of the school and the department into high gear. She does that in many ways, but really notably is strengthening a lot of the alliances between the academy and practice, and really pushes forward research that makes a difference, community-centered research, and mentoring and supporting not only the new faculty, but she really works so closely with faculty at every stage of their academic careers. But today, what will be exciting to hear is some of her research from her award-winning Coastal Resilience Design Studio, CRDS, that really involved quite an interesting network of collaborators from Delaware state agencies, faculty, students across disciplines, and community members, creating some really interesting outcomes that helped really support and allowed communities to position themselves well for the future. This work contributed to investment and strengthening of infrastructure, stimulated local economic development, and did help shape land use policies. So, Jules, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Meg. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you today, and thank you for taking your Friday lunch break with me. Today, I will give you a little bit of my research background. As I was starting to put this project or talk together, I thought it was interesting to think back on how I got to my current projects. So I'll start with my research background. I'll go through and introduce you to the students in the current, what we call studio or lab. Sometimes the students like to call it our lab. And then talk to you about two of my current projects. One's called DEEDS and one's called JBLE. And at the end of the presentation, you'll understand those two acronyms. So I will get started with my research background. I found this timeline to be helpful when I was putting this talk together, because it really talks about, about 10 years worth of a research line that started in about 2014. The work that we did from about 2014 to 2016 was a paper that we got published on ecosystem services for ex-urban landscapes. So I really started for about 10 years prior to that, thinking about how do we get people to change their way of thinking about the American lawn. So I did a lot of work on public perception of suburban and ex-urban landscapes. But there was an interesting finding from that 2016 work that I did that kind of got me going into the initiation of that Coastal Resilience Design Studio that Meg mentioned, and the development of a Coastal Observer app that we use as a tool when we're doing some of our design projects for that team. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll talk about one of the CRDS projects that won quite a lot of awards, but beyond that, really launched into a new way of a new research line as we began to get really curious about more ecosystem benefits for infrastructure projects, larger infrastructure projects, and particularly the sequestration of carbon and the potential to sell carbon market or carbon credits as an investment tool to get larger infrastructure projects built. And along the same time, we were playing around with some ideas for how to make more enduring living shorelines in more energetic environments. And all of that led to 2 funded projects where I'm in about year one or two of both of these projects. One is they're both funded by the Department of Defense, and one's a military deeds project. I'll talk at length about that one today. And the other is another military installation project about green infrastructure or resilient infrastructure at the Joint Base Langley Estes. So I'm just going to launch into these 6 topics and take you through maybe about 30 minutes, and then I'll have time for questions at the end of that. So starting back, like I said, in about 2014, I was working in the Plant and Soil Sciences Department at the University of Delaware. And I was asked by one of my colleagues, Shriram Anamdar, who was a water scientist, if I wanted to participate in a USDA grant application that had to do with water quality and ecosystem services from landscape best management practices. And we developed a project working with other co-PIs who were extension specialists, landscape architect myself, agricultural economics, and an entomologist and wildlife ecologist, Doug Talame. Together, we each were working in our own lane, but we came together and found some really interesting things. And in particular, this project, this public preferences for ecosystem services, became a case that started here with my sort of obsession with getting people to stop doing this, which is having nothing in their landscape except for turf grass, and primarily well-maintained, well-fertilized, frequently mown turf grass. Doug Talame, the previous summer, Doug Talame and I had done some research looking at the American landscape and found that about 92% of the plantable suburban landscapes were planted with turf grass, and that left 8% of the landscape primarily ringed around the house as an area that would be planted, and typically with ornamental plants that didn't offer a lot of biodiversity. So when I had the opportunity to work on this project, the project that I put together was a 3-year project, primarily with my colleague Sue Barton, to work with students to design and develop a alternative to the American lawn as a demonstration. And we chose this neighborhood because it was in the same watershed as our scientists wanted to work in. It was clearly ex-urban, and we had in this community some really outstanding landscape treatments in the areas between the houses. So they left meadow spaces. They had great stormwater areas that were very naturalized, but all of the houses were, 92% lawn. So we thought we could do a demonstration garden in an area like this and see if we could make a difference in the neighborhood and make other people interested in changing their landscape practices. So we knocked on doors and we found somebody who was willing to let us landscape their yard. This is where we started in an area that was very well maintained, lots and lots of grass leading up to a beautiful natural area. Our students worked with us, and this is a diagram from the paper that shows that we left lawn, but we kind of used it as a room, as an outdoor room. And we talked a lot in our educational pieces about using gardens to ring areas so you can produce these outdoor rooms. We did a reforestation and a meadow, and you can see some of the pictures here. And we had much more biodiverse plantings in the area. This was one of the little areas that was a low spot. It was a little bit of a wet area in the yard. So some of you are from the Mid-Atlantic area might recognize some of these plants that they can tolerate some wet feet. Brought a lot of biodiversity and interest to this actual space. And we did grow a backyard meadow. It was extremely successful as we used it as demonstration gardens. People loved coming to this space and walking through this beautiful meadow. And we also were demonstrating different management practices, like just letting the turf grass grow up longer instead of keeping it trimmed so short. So the turf grass that you can see in the open space was mown once every week, whereas these areas under the trees were mown once a month. And just that little bit of difference created a beautiful edge condition and made a more interesting landscape. So we used it as a demonstration garden. We had hundreds and hundreds of people come through and talk to them about ecological landscape principles and the ecosystem services that you might get out of a more diverse landscape. So here again was the before picture, and then here is my after picture. After about 2.5 years of working on this project. This was a great project overall because students did all the planting and learned a lot, and we had all these, like I said, people out here. We did a lot of talks about the project, but the more important thing was we surveyed people, and not just the people who came for the demonstration, but we actually went to the DMV and we had a randomized process for collecting surveys. I didn't go to the DMV. I sent my students to the DMV, and they selected like every 4th visitor to take a survey. And we got a nice amount of surveys about the importance of each of these different ecosystem services or benefits that could be produced in 2 different types of garden: a traditional garden that's primarily turf grass, and a more progressive garden that has a lot more differences in plantings. And we asked people about the most beneficial ecosystem services and the most important impacts that would primarily impact their families and their households. And what we found is that the most beneficial impact were water quality and flood control. And the most important impacts on people's lives would have been if the landscape could help them with flood control and water quality. So this was like a really interesting thing to me, because it really showed me how important people's concern for water quality, flood control, and how maybe we could use that as a strategy to really get people to make the change once and for all to a more biodiverse garden. I just want to point out that undesirable wildlife was part of the negative aspect of a more biodiverse garden. And we did actually see a lot more wildlife in the demonstration garden, for better or worse. And that does alarm people when you start to talk about adding more plants to the garden. People love the idea of pollinators, but they don't love the idea of what we call undesirable wildlife, which in many people think about snakes and ticks and things that are more nerve-wracking in the garden. And of course, that was one of the most important impacts too. So if we are going to make more biodiverse gardens, which can do all these great things, we thought flood control and water quality was a great strategy for selling the idea, but we had to do something also about undesirable wildlife. I'm not going to worry about that right now. I was so intrigued by this flood control and water quality that I thought it was just an interesting finding, and I sort of packed it away. At the same time, I was working on a project in one of the most, it was at the time, the most impoverished town in the state of Delaware, called Laurel, Delaware. And this project in Laurel, Delaware, along with this biodiversity study, really got me interested in the initiation of a coastal resilience design studio. And at the same time, we developed a coastal observer app written through the same grant. So I'm going to share a little bit about this project with you as I move into our project with deeds. So this was my redevelopment project in the town of Laurel. Laurel's a very small town with, like I said, it was the most impoverished town in the state of Delaware. We use ecological design and like thinking about green infrastructure along the edge of their creek that runs through their town as a way of trying to enhance their quality of life, improve community pride, and bring economic development back to the town of. So we were really interested in water quality. I was actually hired to enhance water quality in the Broad Creek, but we ended up talking to the town, and through community engagement, we found out that really what they wanted was an economic driver. So our ecological design was an idea for, could we develop a Riverwalk sense of pride, bring coffee shops and elements back to the town of Laurel. And this project turned out to be extremely successful. Over the years since it's been developed, which was in 2014, it's driven over $3-4 million into the town of Laurel to build these sidewalks, to build playgrounds, to get houses and cottages built, to build a kayak launch. So a lot of this has come to fruition. And I started to think maybe we could do this for other places in the state of Delaware. And so along with a partner of mine, Ed Lewandowski, and with the help of Delaware Sea Grant, we started the Coastal Resilience Design Studio. And so it's not a traditional academic studio, although it was run out of the landscape architecture department. It was really an internship. So it allowed us to pull together interdisciplinary teams of students who were landscape architects, scientists, engineers, policy students, all coming together on one team to come up with ideas for how to help with the challenges that Delaware coastal communities were facing. And in our plans, we always would go in there because we go into a small town because they had a flooding concern. That's why we were there. We were always coming because we had to help with their floods, but we always heard that there were economic concerns and social concerns. Maybe that people were saying, it's not safe to walk on our streets at night, or we don't have a grocery store. We have to drive 10 miles to Walmart to go shopping. So we're always trying to think about how we could bring those ideas back in. So this project, I think, was really successful, as was the Coastal Observer app that came out of it as well. The app is allowed us to sort of think about where are the flooding issues in Delaware. So this was a citizen science project where people can find like where people see flooding or coastal concerns. They could go on and sort of log that event. We ended up using it in CRDS by asking the people who we were working for in these small towns to please share with us when they're having a flooding event. So we could actually, on the back end of this, correlate it with weather data and understand what weather event caused the level of impact that we were seeing in the photographs. So here's an example of one of the photos that came off of the app in a small town where we were working in Pickering Beach, Delaware. This was a 10-year storm that caused a lot of havoc. And if you read this, it's really interesting. It was high water. It was affecting the roadways, the building, and the open space. It was caused by tides, wind, and rain. The event was severe and major. The thing about this was 10-year storm. It just happened to be wind blowing in the right direction. This person is saying that they're feeling astonished by this event. And the comment was, the dune and the fencing washed away, lost both cars. So as designers, we were already working in this community, trying to help them with their coastal challenges. When we got to this point and saw this 10-year storm do this much damage, we actually started to talk to them about retreat plans and give them their FEMA options and their DEMA options, and started to walk them through the process of maybe this is not the place you need to be living right now, rather than even saying that anything we could build could actually make these people safe. So again, you know, this is just sort of trying to show some of the background and the trajectory of where we got to where we are right now. This project in particular had the coastal resilience students very concerned about people's safety in coastal communities along our Delaware Bay, and got us thinking in sort of a new direction about how we wanted to think about coastal resilience. Roughly the same time, we had COVID hit. And one of the things about COVID and CRDS is that we had these great students employed, engineers and policy students and landscape architects, and suddenly they had not much to do. Like life got really quiet for them, and they got really engaged in this particular project, which we call Carbon in the Tidewater. This was a design contest that was run by the Coastal Estuarian Research Federation that brought different university teams in to try and solve a specific challenge in Hampton, Virginia. So this was our part of our presentation. Again, this CRDS was funded completely by Delaware Sea Grant. So just wanted to point that out. This was our project team. And again, this is in Hampton, Virginia, where we see this picture. And this is during COVID. Everybody's outside. But what was interesting here is that of the students that you see where it says our team, I was thinking about this today. There's 6 students, 5 of them are in graduate school, 3 of them went straight into getting a PhD. And I think after I run through this project, you'll see why. This is a really intense and interesting project. The students put a lot of time into it. They had a lot of time to put into it. And the outcomes were very interesting, and it led to a lot more questions. And that's where we ended up with this project that drove us into our next stage of research. That's the DEEDS project and the JBLE project. So Hampton Roads, this is an area in Virginia where there is a lot of sea level rise. There's a lot of potential infrastructure at risk. There's a lot of infrastructure at risk. There's a lot of potential harm coming to this area. There's an active military base, the Joint Base Estes, Langley Estes, and other infrastructure that all has federal facilities, industrial zones, a lot of challenging areas in this place as inundation is starting to creep up. Their students work to understand the clusters of repetitive loss and insurance claims so that they could understand what potentially the human risk is, what the ecological risk is in terms of the water quality and what some of the storm risks are. And also worked hard to understand the regional investment in the area so that they could, this was a kind of a turning point in this where they were looking around in our site visit and they saw a lot of cranes everywhere, and they went back and they really dug in, and there's a lot of building going on, bridges and a lot of infrastructure and a lot of traditional infrastructure. And there was a lot of damage from storms in this area, but a lot of building still happening. So, nobody was backing off the building, even though there was a lot of threats in this area. At the same time, they also determined that there was a lot of money being spent on dredging operations in the area. So all of that sediment became this idea for how we could reuse sediment from dredging operations, which was a new concept to my coastal team. And then we also were looking at the very low number of investment in resilience-based infrastructure. So this was kind of forming the case for why we wanted to think about a future with ecologically based infrastructure and development that continuously contributes to drawing down carbon from the atmosphere and making it the economic standard to tackle the heart of the problem of the area, which is, having these kind of threats. And so they designed 4 different moves. They took like 4 different big swings, and they designed a giant barrier island made from the dredge operations. We had one student on the team who just really worked hard to understand all of the dredge operations, made a giant protective barrier island, some giant living oyster reefs and seagrass, a big wetland revitalization, and then this citizen-driven carbon sequestration program in the inland area called Chesapeake Carbon Gardens.
I'm just especially talking about Jack Harlow.
Sorry, I'm hearing some background noise.
Okay.
There we go. So the Chesapeake Gardens, or the Chesapeake Carbon Gardens was another aspect of like trying to get people involved in biodiversity planting and planting the right plants that would sequester the most gardens. So it kind of took me back to what I had been working on in the past at my Applecross demonstration project. These projects the idea was that all of this infrastructure could protect the urban environment, sequester carbon, clean water, and generate carbon credits for Hampton through the year 2100. So the idea of using these infrastructure elements to generate carbon credits was our unique idea for how this would get potentially partially funded. Each one of these moves came with a nice diagram that showed the public what this could look like, including and also how much carbon would be sequestered, how many gallons of water would be filtered to help with water quality. So it was a very comprehensive project. And again, that project it won an ASLA National Award. It won the actual contest itself, and we had really great outcomes from there. But like I said before, the most important thing about that project was how much we learned and how it drove more research questions. Again, 5 of the students went back to graduate school. Everybody's really interested in pursuing more of these ideas. And so I'll introduce my students who I'm currently working with and some of their projects that are all kind of threads from these prior projects. In UF, my team includes Bryce Donner, who is doing his graduate terminal project in Lewis, Delaware, and Afshin Sadaf, who's a postdoc, and Mojtaba Tamasibi, who is an MLA student. All of those students are funded from the DEEDS project that I'm about to talk about. And then we also have students who I co-advise back at Delaware who are finishing up also on the DEEDS project, Joy McCusker and Martha Ryan. And I advise them with Eric Bardenhagen in the Plant and Soil Science Department there. And then in Florida, also at the JBLE project, my grad student, who many of you know, Lexi Dart, she's getting her PhD here at UF. And her colleague, PhD student at UD is Delaney Doran, who I co-advise, or I'm working with Jack Palayo, who's a coastal engineer. And then I have some other students who are working in the group, Holly Abels, and our own Kyle Dost is one of my students who is starting to get up and running with some of these coastal ideas too. At our studio here with all these students, we're really looking at what criteria and indicators can be employed to establish a baseline to serve as a reference point against which changes and improvements in resilience can be evaluated over time. So every time we would go into a community as the Coastal Resilience Design Studio, the expectation was that we would make them more resilient. So the question that we're always asking is, where do we start in terms of resilience? And have we made any improvements by including any of these infrastructure improvements? We can say we've sequestered more carbon, but are we actually making them more resilient? So that's one of our major questions that we've been working with, and Lexi's project speaks to that. Also, can the addition of these natural-based infrastructure features bolster coastal community resilience? What adaptation strategies and policy decisions are needed to further bolster resilience? And how can predictions of land use changes be used to inform decisions regarding preservation of ecosystems, and what methodologies and approaches can be employed to assess and evaluate ecosystem services in the coastal landscape? So all of our questions, as you can see, really came from our work that led up to this point. So I'll take the next few minutes to talk about the funded project that we have called DEEDS. This is Developing Engineering Practices Using Ecosystem Design Solutions for Future Army. It's a military DEEDS project. And this is a project between the University of Delaware, LSU, and the Army Corps of Engineers arm, which is their research arm called ERDIC. And then when I came to Florida, I brought some of this project work with me. And we also work with the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary and some engineering firms, including EA Engineering, to help with this project. The focus of this project all goes back to the carbon in the tidewater. We're really interested after that project to find out, can shellfish contribute to enhancing the safety of coastal communities in any, can this become self-generative infrastructure? We want to study it and install it and evaluate it to understand if this can contribute to community resilience. So this project is focusing on understanding the ecological and physical attributes that are required to actually make shellfish-based infrastructure. We're using a transdisciplinary approach to selecting sites to work on. And then from 5 sites in the Chesapeake and Delaware Bay watersheds, we're going to design and permit 2 of them. That's the phase we're in right now. We're working on designing and permitting some of these installations. And then we'll have 2 years, 2.5 years left on the grant to install and monitor the sites afterwards so we can start to make some better predictions about how these are going to work in the future. And we're going to use agent-based modeling and future land use planning scenarios to see if any of these infrastructure plans could actually help communities. So why are we working here? The Mid-Atlantic region actually needs coastal defense pretty badly. They have degraded wetlands all through the Delaware Bay and the Chesapeake Bay. There is a real increased severity of storms and nuisance tides in the recent years. The area suffers from double the global rate of relative sea level rise, and that has to do with some of the land subsidence as well. In Delaware alone, the infrastructure grade is D, which is below the national average. And this coastal area, like the marine economy, is so important to the Mid-Atlantic region. It employs a lot of people. There's a lot of businesses that are associated with the marine economy. It contributes to billions of dollars in wages and a lot of contribution to the areas, to the gross domestic product are coming from this area. So we want to work in here and think about coastal defense because we are losing a lot. When you lose high quality functioning wetlands because of erosion, it degrades water quality, it threatens communities, it threatens military operations, it threatens infrastructure, it's threatening agriculture. And I didn't even talk about that, but the salinization of agriculture is a big concern in this region, and it threatens livelihoods. And the military is concerned about this because there's so many coastal military installations. There's about 18 of them on the East Coast alone. The effects of coastal flooding are going to reverberate beyond the boundaries of the military installations themselves. The communities adjacent to the military installations have a very wide variety of demographic and socioeconomic makeup, which drives our concern about their vulnerability. And land managers of military installations are really asking for much more analysis and many more resources to help them implement solutions that can keep their land, which is worth billions of dollars, from going underwater too quickly. I am aligned with the Engineering with Nature and part of the Network for Engineering with Nature. This is a group from the Army Corps of Engineers, and they're really interested in using nature to engineer solutions. And it's a great group if you're not familiar with it. They have a wonderful podcast, and they have a really robust network and a lot of resources, which you can find online under Engineering with Nature. So the DEEDS project is multidisciplinary. We have people in lots of different professions working on this, including marine scientists, civil engineers, shellfish, wetland ecologists, computer scientists. Our idea is that while most living shorelines feel like a little bit of an edge treatment, we really want to consider it more of a transect. And how can we establish a transect aspect of that addresses multi-habitat, including oysters, including SAVs, like what's every tool in our toolbox to keep the places upland safe and dry. But as seas do start to rise, how do we jump that infrastructure and move these wetlands through urban environments? So these are some of the things that we are concerned and starting to really try and figure out. Our areas of interest include Delaware sites and Maryland sites. We chose Aberdeen Proving Ground because it is a military site and it's a really interesting one to work on. And so I'll tell you first about our work at Aberdeen that we've been working on. So we started by mapping a lot of the scenarios and what's happening here with sea level rise. The light blue is the moderate 1.2 sea level rise projection. And at 1.2 feet is about 2050. So you can see that this island, what's left of this island is a little bit of there's not much left of the island, I should say. And just to back up, Aberdeen Proving Ground is a military installation that tests munitions. And so there's not people on this island. There are contractors on the island who work on testing munitions primarily. In addition to the sea level rise, pretty dire sea level rise situation, we mapped for storm surge and fetch and wetlands and the availability of SAV, or submerged aquatic vegetation. And we looked at a lot of different aspects of the whole APG installation, which is a very large portion of Harford County, Maryland. And in particular, this island, Spizzuti Island, because it has worse outcomes than the APG proper, which is the part to the west. So we looked at a lot of different aspects of this as well. And we worked with EA Engineering, who's also has a project here to and various stakeholders to sort of understand the areas of criticality. What's the most important places to protect for various reasons? And we came up with a methodology for determining those most critical areas. And so we have 3 projects that we're really working on, and I'm going to go over them pretty quickly. One is site suitability for living shorelines. Afshin Sadaf is working on that. The other is future land use change and impacts to water quality, working on that with Martha. And blue carbon modeling and valuation is what we're working on with Moshe Taba. The site suitability project was our first step in understanding what can we possibly do to help, particularly with that Spizzuti Island, to build that up so we make sure that it doesn't go underwater by 2050. And so Afshin's been working on developing a site suitability model. And we started with trying to understand what are the variables and weightings that we would need to model this site for living shorelines or hybrid shorelines. And we're really thinking about the physical and biological variables at this point, because as I mentioned, there are no people. There's infrastructure and there's some structures, but it's not like an urban area. And that gets to the point that right now what's completed is this living shoreline suitability model for Aberdeen. The next step is to take it into Delaware where there are people, and we're going to add a social component. We're going to add the SOVI index and try to figure out how these variables, how do we weight social variables to also understand the modeling of where we would put these nature-based infrastructure treatments. And so Afshin's also been looking at which are the most effective tools to do this work. The 10 variables that we came up with for physical characteristics are listed here. We also looked at ecological characteristics, so biological variables. And we're trying to work to develop a spatial model to determine suitability for living shorelines, so we can use it as a first step in understanding where we can pinpoint solutions. The first slide you see here is the answer. So I asked my students to develop these graphics so we could understand, what does it mean to be suitable for living shoreline? Well, it means that you have a very gentle slope. The wetlands are already present. It's a sandy shore type. It's lower energy versus a hybrid solution where it's higher energy. There are no wetlands already present. It's more rocky. It's more steep. So these are graphics that sort of show, if I say it's suitable for a living shoreline, you get the sense of what that might look like, or suitable for a hybrid, you get a sense of what it might look like. And the model also predicts if it's not suitable. It might not be suitable because it's already hardened, as you can see in this picture here, or it might already have dunes or something that means it doesn't require a living shoreline. So Afshin went through the process of data collection and data processing and converted all the data raster scales to 1 meter by 1 meter and assigned a common scale value. And then we used the methodology that came from a living shoreline feasibility model developed by our partners at the the Partnership for the Delaware Shoreline, and research articles that we found to determine what should be the weighting for this tool for each of these 13 variables. And then we worked to spatialize the data. And so with the spatialization, you can see blue and green on the map. The blue is suitable for green infrastructure or living shoreline. The blue is suitable for hybrid. And Afshin's been working on 2 different types of methods of doing this, but suitability modeler and a traditional called weighted sum. And then she had weighted and unweighted. So on the weighted, we use the living shoreline feasibility weights to determine like which variables are most important. Storm surge is more important and fetch is more important than, say, habitat, for example. And so after doing that work, she looked at the classification and the results and we realized that they're unequal and equal weighting in both methods, or just sort of by varying degree, but the majority of this area could be fortified with either a living shoreline or a hybrid shoreline. So her next step and our next step is to really get down in the weeds as to like, why are some of these areas with weight or without weight, or with one of these models versus the other model different? So we're going and doing a segment analysis and using like a ground truthing validation on segments where there are different types of outputs, comparing that GIS model output with what is the background for how we did the weighting in the first place. So we're using the living shoreline feasibility model as that segment analysis to ground truth these, to really figure out which of these methods is the best method and which is the most accurate. And that's what we're in the process of doing right now. And as soon as she figures that out, I think she'll have a nice paper to get out the door. In the meantime, we're also trying to share back with APG some ideas as to how we could help with the living, with their outcomes. And so we have designed some test sites that need to be modeled. Moj Chaba did these renderings of the idea of adding some breakwaters down in some of these areas that have the worst outcomes, using thin layer placement of dredge sediments. Again, going back to the carbon in the Tidewater project, a lot of our design solutions, they're cumulative, which is really interesting. So we could reinforce this entire edge using a hybrid approach because it's very high energy, but that would add a layer of sediment that could continue to enhance the marsh. We do know that oysters are not going to grow in this area. So our next step, again, is to think about how we can add the social component to this for the Delaware side, and also the additional ecological indicators that are going to help us understand whether an oyster-based shoreline is appropriate or not. So the other two projects, and I just have one slide for each of these projects. Martha is working on future land use change. She is doing her work using TerSet modeling and Althea, which is about water quality. So she's really interested in understanding how to improve water quality in the Delaware and inland basins. All of this should be applicable to the entire Mid-Atlantic region once she comes up with her methodology. She's currently working on figuring out the drivers of land cover change and then estimating the predicted land cover changes so that she could quantify the impacts on surface water quality. I think this was a really interesting project, and she has some of her results here that indicate there are changes in land use over the past 25 years that indicate where agriculture has turned into development, or forested wetlands have become open water like tidal wetlands, herbaceous wetlands. So we are seeing transitions that are going to be interesting as she feeds this information into the water quality modeler, which is the stage she's at right now. And Mo is working on blue carbon model and valuation to try and understand how these losses of land in these areas, like the one at APG, is going to, how much carbon it's going to release back into the atmosphere. So he's gone pretty far with this. His objectives were to first understand the Blue Coastal Carbon Modeler, which is part of a suite of tools that is called INVEST, and then documenting those results for APG and using it as a tool to communicate how we could make changes to land use. I think he's gotten pretty far. It's a complicated process, so I'm not going to get too far into it, but he was able to find a really interesting data source from NASA, which is a carbon monitoring system. That information gets fed into Esri. Then he's using QGIS plugins to help with his predictions, and ultimately getting to the INVEST tool, which will help him understand the carbon pools, but also calculate the value of the carbon. And in his results from that INVEST tool, he was able to find that the projected net present value of carbon sequestered indicates a deficit of 1.16 million under a conservative assumption of the value of carbon, and 4.72 under a non-conservative assumption of the value of carbon. So, with that information, we could talk to stakeholders about how important it would be to do those edge treatments that we're designing with the engineers to try to shore up that land. It's just one way of starting to talk to people about the value of the land lost to changing environments. So that's the DEEDS project, and there's lots of work going on with that, and a lot of other lines of inquiry with the other scientists on the project, and we have about 2.5 years left on the project. So I'm excited for the outcomes of the entire thing. In the meantime, we're also working on a project that's exploring the potential of self-generative infrastructure, again at Langley Air Force Base and the adjacent communities. And this is where we started with the baseline. And I think this has been really exciting because I got to go back to Hampton Roads to work. So it's in the same area where we were doing the carbon and the Tidewater project. We've already been here. We know this area really well. And they've asked us to come back and work on this project because this military base is highly threatened by sea level rise and intensifying storms, and it's losing its wetlands. And so and the adjacent communities are quite vulnerable. So Lexi and I have been working on developing this methodology to define the region's flood resilience baseline, is what we're calling it for now, until we think of a better name for it. We're modeling the existing conditions and suitability for shellfish-based solutions. We're working with the stakeholders to understand what they want to see here and to understand the risks and the resources. And then we're going to develop designs and test the designs with our engineer friends so that hopefully they'll get built. This is a map that came out of a stakeholder meeting where we had a lot of people from the installation and the community all in a room back in October 21 before we got the grant. And we were talking about possible solutions. And here's the coastal flood resilience map for the city of Hampton, Virginia, which is what we've been working on. And I'm really, really excited about this work. I think it has great potential to be able to go to land managers or city managers and say, here's where your coastal community is most at risk or has the least amount of resilience, where you could do something to enhance the resilience. So in all of these maps, the green is sort of the highest resilience, the red is the lowest resilience. And we're really working to try and understand this through this methodology that we've adopted from an urban flood methodology that uses the indicators that you see here, like drainage capacity and ratio of water area and the slope that feed into a map that's created that's called resistance. So our first sub-indicator map is resistance. Our second sub-indicator map is adaptation. So how close are people to relief services? And how many people what is the percentage of exposed vulnerable population? That becomes our adaptation map. And then our third map is this recovery map. And that's nighttime light and vegetation restoration. So looking at an impact and then checking to see how quickly the lights come back on is nighttime. And then looking at an impact and over time, how fast the vegetation rebounds is the recovery piece. All of those go into creating a flood resistant, a flood resilient map. And that's the end of the process if you're just worried about flood resilience. The new thing that we're working on is, what about the coastal flood probability and the coastal flood resilience? So we developed a method that of indicators that feed into this coastal flood probability that have to do with the mean, the high tides and some of the tidal indicators, and that turns into the coastal flood probability map. So I know that this is a lot of maps that are just showing a lot of red and green, but our key findings are getting to be really interesting, and they continue every week to be like exploring new things that we can take from this. And so each one of these maps has its own set of information that we can use with stakeholders to talk about, but we're trying to pinpoint areas and ground truth this right now, so that we can be confident that it's accurate. But we believe that it's a pretty accurate tool to understand resilience in an area. What the coastal flood resilience showed was it's primarily medium-low coastal flood resilience, with the least resilient areas occurring along the coast and the river systems. These big green patches are the military base or natural areas like forests or wetlands, but the edges of those are threatened. So again, our edge treatments is our big nature-based infrastructure could be helpful in just like we did at Aberdeen, in thinking about ways that we could bring that elevation back up and start to keep the resilient areas resilient, if that makes sense. We're still trying to work on the terminology for all of this, but each map contains pieces of information, and we're really excited about all that it's uncovering for ways that we can quantify coastal flood resilience, which in the literature that we've looked, we haven't been able to really find a different methodology for doing this. So we have lots of next steps. Like I said, every day we talk, we have next steps. We really want to start to think about ways of zooming in on this information, ground truthing it, and then also using it to pinpoint a location where we can start to model nature-based infrastructure and see how it comes to, and what outcomes it has in enhancing flood resilience. So can we flip any of these red areas to green with the addition of an infrastructure project that we then model and go from and develop that as a toolbox? So one of the things we're going to do this spring is go back to Delaware. They've built a wave tank up there, and we're going to take the bathymetry of the area and the topography of an area that we want to study, and we're going to be looking at, if we put these infrastructure treatments in, where does the sediment actually move to? Can we accrete more land with a nature-based infrastructure? And what are our opportunity zones for working to enhance the resilience around the base and with adjacent communities? So we recently shared this back with our engineer friends who are working on this project with us. It's a combination of ideas of where we'll potentially be working to do those tests, and everyone's just having a dialogue about where we want to do it. This is really interesting because at the end of the Air Force runway is really going underwater, and it's just one of those things where it's a difficult situation, because if you put new wetlands in that region, there's also concern for bird airstrike. So we have to be very careful with nature-based infrastructure around these military bases. But these are some of the areas where we might be working in the very near future. And that's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jules. That was really fascinating and multi-layered. We do have a question in the chat for you. We might have time for one question or two. This is from Jean Ren, who had to go to class, which started at 12:50, but he had a burning question he posted. What are the biological mechanisms Let me get this. Let's see. What are the biological mechanisms of using shellfish to enhance coastal resilience? And follow up, and to what extent can shellfish-based infrastructure mitigate sea level rise's impact on coastal areas?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. What we're thinking about is can shellfish continuously keep pace with sea level rise? And there's some evidence in the research that it can, because it's living, right? And they continue to grow, and they will seek out a little bit higher area. So as sediments start to come into a system and shellfish have the ability to continue to grow, could they keep pace with sea level rise, maybe with moderate levels of sea level rise? So they just have the ability to continuously, grow. And I think that that's what he's getting at. Do you think that's what he means, Meg?
Well, I couldn't let, I don't want to get into
Okay.
that. I'm not sure.
So, it's complicated too, because I mean, we work with a lot of shellfish specialists to be able to, rely on them as we're doing our design work to say, what can we expect from the shellfish? In Delaware, we have oysters and mussels. So we have a variety of different shellfish that can really help to either work on that idea of resistance. So Lexi and I are really excited about the idea of resistance in the landscape. It has to do with roughness. And if you have shellfish, you have a rougher area that they have to travel against. It can help slow down wave energy. And so as you continuously add all these more biodiversity into these edges, you have a lot more roughness, and that could help. The resistance could help with the resilience.
How did you, I'm curious with some of you're working in such a rich and creating such an interesting multidisciplinary collaborative kind of context. And sometimes sparks can really fly, and we all have very different world views and different kinds of methodologies, and as you were saying, different toolkits you bring. What did you see happening as the teams came together and evolved at the student level, and then with some of your engagement with so many others from across a wide swath of disciplines?
Yeah, Meg, I think it's great. I think landscape architects are really well positioned to moderate through different fields of study, because we tend to be generalists and we like to look at different fields of study to inform our own work. So I have found that bringing students together in particular, but also colleagues, we don't necessarily speak the same language. A plan is not the same. A plan is not a plan for different fields of study. A design is not a design for different fields of study, right? So what I call a design, my engineer friends don't call it design. We think differently. So we have to come up with a common vocabulary early in the process to make it easier for us to communicate. And then we have to understand what each other's strengths are. So when I'm working with students, I just talk to them about their strengths. What do you love to do? Let's have a discussion about what are you good at? What do you bring to this project? And what we find really quickly is the policy students absolutely love to read comprehensive plans and do stuff that landscape architect students don't like to do. The landscape architects want to pick up the pen and be creative. The engineers want to figure out how to make it work. So as soon as we all understand, I'm not asking an engineer to come onto my team and be a landscape architect, and I'm not asking a landscape architect to figure it out and be an engineer. Everyone needs to play to their strengths, which also means people are dropping in and out of the process just a little bit, because you don't need everybody at once. So you have to learn how to keep everybody busy in an interdisciplinary team and give them tasks to make sure that they feel like they have value at all stages of the process. It's one thing I've learned by working in these teams.
It's a lot of ensemble play.
It is.
Going. Any other question or comment, please unmute yourself if we have anything else you'd like to ask or remark on before we come to a close.
Alpa, do you have a?
Yeah. Hi, Jules. Thank you so much. That was so complex and so overwhelming, and you do it on top of everything else. And I think that was really impressive. I was curious in one of your projects, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name of the project. You mentioned that the improving the economic condition of that place, of that city, was really what was driving a lot of the motivations. And I was curious if you felt, as an educator, if we were doing enough in our teaching pedagogies or courses about, yeah, in terms of preparing our students to tackle on these questions of economic incentives, which is not just a community-wide priority, but also a priority for leadership, for governance, for everyone outside of landscape architecture. It's about like, okay, what's the economic benefit of this project, and how can we bring in more dollars to the community? Could you reflect on that a little bit more, maybe as an educator as well as a scholar?
Yeah, but I think it's a really great question. And in the curriculum that we have in landscape architecture, it is difficult to teach everything we need to teach, and also make sure we have that really important factor, which is a deeper understanding of how our work can impact the economy of a place. And it can very dramatically. A lot of steps have to happen in order for that to happen. It might be the best thing to do to have like an interdisciplinary studio where you actually invite people with a background in economics to come into the team as well. So we have some of these complex interactions and an understanding of how that can happen. We work with, as the Coastal Resilience Design Studio, our creative director is, he really does a great job with understanding a place, and especially the economic needs of a place. So he'll do a market analysis for us as we're moving into the place. Without the market analysis, we don't have as much information to go on. But with the market analysis, we understand where is the closest retail, what would be a unique value add to this community. How much does it cost to have a retail shop in this community? We've done micro retail in a small town in Little Creek because we knew that people couldn't afford to own a big shop. So we have, but the market analysis is key on all of that. And I think that was one of the benefits of CRDS, is to have a person on the team who could do those type of market analyses before we started our work. And I don't know how you get that in every single project. We hit the jackpot with our team, and having that ability to use that as well. That's a great question. Makes me think, what's my next move?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Alpa, and everyone else for coming. Jules, really exciting. Can't wait to have you back and hear what the next update is. And also mark your calendar, in the blink of an eye, February 23rd will be here. So please, let's rejoin over lunch to hear Dr. Cleary Larkin and the research and scholarship that is happening in historic preservation. And then to cap off our series for the semester, Dr. Brian Franz, who just took up the reins of the PhD program, is going to be sort of looking back to look forward, to see what the next, he'll have some comments on directions he sees the PhD program evolving in, and that will wrap up on March 1st, again at noon. Fantastic presentation today, Jules. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for everybody. I appreciate it.